Music history often gets told through the lens of big works, symphonies, operas, oratorios, the occasional large-scale string quartet. But the reality is that these big works are numerically the exception rather than the rule. Much of music history and music listening before the era of recorded music takes place in the realm of little works. And that is no less true for Beethoven, like the three variation sets he wrote for piano and cello between 1796 and 1801. The first set, and probably the second set, flowed out of his concert tour of 1796, where he went to Berlin, met the Duport brothers, wrote two cello sonatas, and probably turned down a job offer from King Friedrich Wilhelm. The third set was composed in 1801, as his career in Vienna was starting to take off. All three sets use popular melodies by composers who had already died. See the Conquering Hero is from Handel's oratorio Judas Maccabeus, one of a handful of Handel's oratorios that were receiving popular revivals in German-speaking territories at the time, and which Beethoven would have probably observed in rehearsal when he was in Berlin, and quite possibly heard in performance when he was in Vienna. The other two variation sets use songs from Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute, an opera that was wildly popular throughout German-speaking lands at the time because it was in German and thus represented a growing pride in Germanness, and you can hum the tunes. When all three were first published, Beethoven did not assign them an opus number, but rather the various publishers assigned them an in-house number indicating a publication sequence. Now, the middle variation has an opus number, opus 66, but that number actually wasn't assigned to it until 1819, probably for a subsequent edition of the work. For Beethoven's works, this is the beginning of the Wu numbers, and this stands for Werke ohne Opuszahl, or work without opus number. For comparison, so Beethoven has 138 works that he assigned an opus number to, but he has 205 works that have a Wu number, a Werke ohne Opuszahl. And this underscores my initial point about little works being the numerical precedent compared to big works. Like the first two cello sonatas, these variation sets are generally piano heavy. Each of the first two even has a variation where the cello doesn't even play. And in the second variation set, there are scads of moments where the cello is basically window dressing. However, the third variation set on Bei Männern welche Liebe fühlen from the Magic Flute exhibits more parity between the two instruments, setting up the duo style that can be observed in the remaining three cello sonatas. All three sets follow a typical variation set progression of increasing deviation from a theme, incorporating at least one variation in a minor key, and closing with a more substantial and drawn-out final variation. Now, in Beethoven's output, these works are rather important in two small but critical ways. First, they are examples of his love of variation form, evidenced by the piles of variation sets he wrote at all points in his career, and in how he used the musical progression inherent in a variation set as the basis for some of his larger works. Those think of the slow movement of the Fifth Symphony, and even the finale of the Ninth Symphony come to mind as moments that are indebted to the variation set idea. And from a biographical perspective, these three works are important because they cover an important transition in Beethoven's career. We're moving from his early period to his middle period, or what is sometimes called his heroic period, when Beethoven became Beethoven. His career in Vienna was really starting to take off in the first years of the 1800s, and he was increasingly popular among the wealthy arts patrons in the city. But He also probably suffered a significant illness in late 1796. We have very little biographical information from him from that time. But we think that this illness he suffered in 1796, when he basically went radio silent, became the catalyst for the deafness that grew increasingly worse over the course of his life. And in fact, his first acknowledgement of his hearing loss to another human being comes from a letter dating to the beginning of 1801, when he was writing the variation set on Bei Männern welche Liebe fühlen. So be sure to catch these small but critically important works live on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central Time on the Carver Chamber Music Project Facebook page and YouTube channel. We look forward to seeing you then.